Trees in every country. Trees, you know we can work together and learn what we need to meet the challenge.
Hello, and welcome to the ISA Conference Rewind video podcast series. I'm Tanisha Price, instructional designer with the International Society of Arboriculture. Today, ISA is proud to bring you a presentation by Kaitlyn Pike, where she explains her study on the impact of urban development on trees. This presentation was originally given at the 2021 ISA Virtual Conference, so the views seen here are those of the presenter. Anyone interested in preserving the world's trees should find this presentation compelling. Now, sit back and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaitlyn Pike, and I'm a PhD student in the Urban Natures Lab at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And today I will be talking about tree preservation on residential properties from the perspective of the homeowner. So to give a quick outline of my presentation, I will briefly discuss the literature regarding urban development and its impact on trees, followed by an introduction of the study site. Next, I will summarize the findings of my master's research that was an evaluation of a residential tree preservation ordinance. And this will be followed by the main topic of today's presentation, which is a follow-up survey of homeowners' knowledge, practices, and perceptions of the trees and natural areas on their residential properties. And then finally, I will discuss the implications of this research. So first, a little background to get us oriented. In the United States, urban forests represent 35% of all urban land cover. They deliver benefits to 2/3 of the population. They provide significant ecosystem services, and they produce over $18 billion in net annual benefits. However, rising urban population and development threatens the diversity and extent of urban trees, which not only lowers ecosystem service benefits, but can actually cause ecosystem disservices such as damage to human health and property. Furthermore, development and urbanization is accelerating, which threatens existing and future canopy cover. So regarding urban development, a review of the literature found that when no tree preservation ordinance is in place, development can lead to tree loss and a decline in canopy cover. Survival decreases as proximity to development increases, particularly for more mature trees. Challenges often occur from root severance and soil compaction. And finally, species differ in their tolerance to construction disturbance. So the two studies that I will be talking about today took place in the city of Highland Park, which is an affluent suburban city about 25 miles north of Chicago in the Midwestern United States. This is a city of 30,000 residents and nearly 50% canopy cover. Highland Park employs a city forester, an assistant city forester, and a forestry intern with the combined task of managing 30,000 public trees, as well as oversight on tree removal and protection permits as they relate to private trees on private properties. Because of the city forester's background in academia, which includes a doctorate in forestry, he also created my temporary position with some extra available funding. And speaking of funding, it's worth noting that Highland Park has an above average budget in terms of forestry departments. It hovers around $1 million annually. And this is actually 3 times the national average in the US for forestry departments of similar population sizes. So here on the right is an aerial photo of the city of Highland Park. So Highland Park is also significant for its contributions to pop culture. It was the filming location for several 80s John Hughes classics, such as Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which if you've seen the film, you definitely recognize this building. It was also a filming location for Weird Science, 16 Candles, and Home Alone. It's also been home to celebrities such as Michael Jordan. You could see his gates here, Mr. T, and the lead singer of the Smashing Pumpkins. And then Highland Park was also home to landscape architect Jens Jensen, who has constructed several green spaces there. And it has a building designed by architect Frank Lloyd Wright on its registry of historic places. So over the years, Highland Park has passed several tree preservation ordinances that are considered models for tree protection on public and private properties. These ordinances classify all trees over 8 inches or 20 centimeters in diameter as either protected, key, or heritage trees based on species and size. So even on private property, none of these classified trees may be removed without approval from the city council, as well as the local neighborhood tree council. And trees with heritage status are the most protected species. And so receiving a permit for the removal is incredibly difficult. And anytime a developer wants to construct or redevelop a building in Highland Park, they must receive a building permit. To receive approval, developers must hire a certified arborist to conduct a pre-construction inventory and create a tree preservation plan that indicates where each tree is on site, as well as the respective tree protection zones around each tree or group of trees. And here is an example of how trees are classified by the city ordinance that I mentioned in the previous slide. So as I mentioned, all trees over 8 inches or 20 centimeters in diameter, except buckthorn and willow, are classified as key species, which means a permit is needed for their removal at any point. If they are to be removed, they must be replaced with 2 trees. And if removed unlawfully, then the homeowner or developer will be fined $1,000 for every tree that is unlawfully removed. And classification status then increases with size and by species. So if we go over here to the heritage trees, the most protected trees, these are mainly like the oaks, the elms, hickory, and walnut. These are significant to that region near Chicago. So heritage trees are very unlikely to be removed through a permit, but must be replaced with 4 trees if they are granted permission. And if removed unlawfully, there's a fine of $4,000 per tree. So with this context in mind of the study site, we set out with the following research aims. We wanted to better understand the efficacy of tree preservation ordinances. And then afterwards, we wanted to better understand the knowledge, perceptions, and practices of homeowners regarding the trees and natural areas on their property. Okay, so now I will briefly tell you about my first study, which was an evaluation of Highland Park's tree preservation ordinance. It was a part of my master's thesis where I designed this research project that would assess the condition and mortality of trees on properties that had experienced residential redevelopment. So that is infill construction where pre-existing homes were demolished and then brand new homes were built in their place. So for the sake of time, I will move pretty quickly through my methods, but I did want to highlight them. So this initial study began with a plan and permit analysis that involved finding residential homes that met certain requirements of having been completely demolished and redeveloped between the years 2004 and 2015. I used physical case files to find the tree preservation plans that allowed me to determine which trees were meant to be preserved on properties. And I will show you this in the following slide. And so I was able to use the permit numbers that were linked to these redevelopments and notify homeowners that I would be coming on their properties to survey their trees and that they could opt out by contacting the forestry department. So this worked really well for our research, working alongside the municipality and having these permit numbers linked as kind of like a legitimate way to come and look at the trees on the properties. So properties that had not experienced any recent construction were used as our control, which we called our comparison sites or comparison properties. And here's an example of a construction site map with a tree preservation plan that I determined to be viable. So as you can see here, this is where the new home is proposed to be built. And then these trees here with X's are marked for removal. And that means that they were approved through a permit process, through the tree council, the neighborhood tree council, and all those different routes to get the tree removed. And then if we zoom in, you can see here is an example of how each tree was measured for its DBH. And then there's a tree protection zone placed around all of these trees with the X's and dashed lines. So having the trees intended to be removed and the trees intended to be preserved clearly marked on these maps allowed me to calculate an overall tree preservation rate for each property, and then overall for all of these properties by tallying how many preserved trees were still remaining in the years after construction occurred. So when I was finally ready to go into the field, this is an example of the inventory protocol I used. I measured each tree within 100 feet or 30 meters of the house foundation. I gave it a unique number. The tree preservation site plan that I just showed you was then used to record whether the tree was preserved or had been removed after construction took place. If the tree was still there, I recorded its genus and species, size, condition, proximity to hardscape, level of soil compaction, and soil moisture. And if the tree was removed, I still proceeded with measuring proximity to hardscape, soil compaction, and soil moisture because I was also interested in whether these factors played a role in tree mortality or removal following construction. So for tree condition, I used both a traditional method that the city uses, that many cities will use, the good, fair, poor, but I also wanted to make use of an index that makes use of crown and trunk assessment. So this included things like stag heading and tip dieback, and some of the other things that we found in the literature show stress from development. And then I measured proximity to various types of hardscape with a digital hypsometer, and then measured soil compaction at different levels of the critical root zone and different depths with a digital pentrometer. So a quick overview of the results before I show you the next study, but we found that the city's ordinance was successful in preserving trees during and after construction occurs. So this was evident through an overall preservation rate of nearly 75%, tree condition ratings that were comparable to trees on properties that had not experienced recent construction, having found no correlation between proximity to newly developed foundation and observed tree condition or mortality, and the discovery of healthy soil compaction levels within tree protection areas and the critical root zones of preserved trees. So these findings align with recent studies that consider the outcomes of tree ordinances on tree health, where ordinances were found to increase urban canopy cover and protect street trees during construction. So I definitely breezed through this study for the sake of time, but if you'd like to learn more, there's more details, of course, on the methods, more thorough discussion of the results. You can find this in the published version of this first study, and feel free to email me if you'd like a copy. Okay, so now I will tell you about the follow-up research that I completed, which involved the analysis of residential surveys, which were distributed to the same homeowners in this first study that I just talked about. So in order to get a better understanding of the knowledge, practices, and perceptions of homeowners involved in our first study, we designed a set of surveys that were adapted from previous survey research, which asked similar questions in a city without a tree preservation ordinance. So in our study, in the second study, we surveyed the same group of homeowners from study one, the first one I just discussed, where study homeowners were those that owned newly constructed homes. So they're homeowners of the homes that were just recently built. And then our comparison group were the owners of older homes that had not received any major construction or renovation since first being built several decades ago. So for this presentation, study homeowners will be highlighted in indigo, so dark blue, and then comparison homeowners will be highlighted in teal, a lighter blue. And for this research, we followed the Dillman method, which involved sending homeowners a notice, a letter with a survey, a postcard, and then a final letter with a survey, all through the US Postal Service. And they were also given the option to reply online. So our questions were focused on demographics, planting and removal, maintenance and landscaping, preferences and decision-making, relationships with landscaping, tree care, and forestry professionals, and environmental attitudes regarding enjoyment of nature and the altering of nature for human benefit. These surveys were sent to the 147 homeowners who participated in the original study, and our survey data was analyzed using cross-tabulation and chi-square. So here are the front pages of both homeowner surveys. On the left is the survey distributed to study homeowners, and on the right is the survey that was distributed to comparison homeowners. And as you can see, we put my university's logo big and bold on the front of the survey as an extra way to build rapport with homeowners. And here is an example of some older homes that may have been included in both studies, just to give you a visual representation. This represents the comparison group. Again, these are older homes that had not experienced any recent redevelopment since initially being constructed in the middle of the previous century. On the other hand, these are examples of new homes in the city of Highland Park that have been built in the past 2 decades. The homes that were shown previously, the comparison homes, are thus being demolished and replaced with these, and in part the reason why the city may be losing trees. So this group represents our study homeowners. All right, so now we come to the results of study number 2. So in total, we received responses from 67 homeowners with a total response rate of 46%. We asked homeowners how long they have lived in Highland Park and how long they have lived at their current home. The purpose of these questions were to understand the relationship of homeowner to their property and to ensure that our homeowners' demographics matched that of our previous study. So we found that study homeowners moved to the city more recently and have lived in their homes for a shorter period of time. Conversely, comparison homeowners have lived in Highland Park longer and have lived in their older homes for longer. So unsurprising, but these findings fit with the scope of both of our studies, where study homeowners are the new owners of brand new homes, whereas comparison homeowners have owned and lived in their current homes, which are built around the mid-20th century for longer. In terms of other demographics, we found that study homeowners own properties that are worth nearly double than the comparison group, and with majority of their household incomes being more than $250,000 a year. Both groups are most likely to work full time, but the comparison group, it was more likely to be retired, which we found to be statistically significant. For both groups, education was similar, with the majority having received a bachelor's degree. And then for age, we found that the study group is about a generation younger. So to summarize, the owners of new homes are newer to the city, have higher property values and property incomes or household incomes, while the comparison group has lived in the city longer and are more likely to be retired. Across both groups, though, we find higher property value and income when compared to the US national average. So now that we have a better understanding of these two groups based on the demographics context, we can start to explore decision-making and preferences at the residential property level. So one of the critical parts of this survey was understanding how involved the new study homeowners were in the decision-making process involving trees during the development of their properties. For our study group, nearly 3/4 of the homeowners owned the property at the time of redevelopment. And of these, only 1/3 reported making any decisions about tree removal on their property. Less than a quarter consulted an arborist, and nearly 1/3 were removed from the process entirely by stating that they did not know what happened during development. The residents that were aware of trees being removed report that small diameter trees were most likely to be removed, though nearly 20% reported that mature trees were removed during development. We also wanted to explore their knowledge of whether trees were planted after development occurred. This provides us with clues to how involved or removed these homeowners may have been from the process of tree preservation on their property. But for this study group, again, a little over half didn't know whether trees were planted after development took place as per the city code, and only 15% recalled whether these trees lived or died. So as you may recall, per the city's tree preservation ordinance, replacement tree plantings are required for any trees removed, but few homeowners were aware if they were required to replant trees and whether or not these trees had lived or died following replanting. Next, we asked both groups of homeowners whether they planted trees after assuming residence. For the owners of new homes, these would be trees planted that were not a requirement of city code, but were instead voluntarily planted on their own accord. So we found that the homeowners who owned older homes were more likely to plant trees, and when they did, more than half planted 5 or more trees since assuming residence. This makes sense given that these residents have lived on these properties for a longer period of time. Next, we asked both groups of homeowners whether they had witnessed the death of mature trees after assuming residence. We found that comparison homeowners in older homes were more likely to report that mature trees had died since assuming residence. Again, this makes sense that homeowners who lived on these properties longer would have more time to witness tree mortality, particularly as it relates to pests and diseases such as emerald ash borer and Dutch elm disease that kind of came in before a lot of these newer trees or these new properties were being built. But that being said, we found that these differences were not statistically significant, so meaning that both groups were just as likely to plant trees and witness tree loss on their properties as it relates to statistical significance. And when purchasing their current homes, both groups of homeowners agreed that resale value and proximity to schools were the most influential reasons for purchasing their property. These represent more practical reasons for deciding to purchase a home in comparison to the other options available, such as the forest-like nature of the community or the prevalence of trees on the property. When asked what preferences they had for the landscaping on their property, both groups of homeowners agreed that they were more likely to prefer a partially landscaped lot, as demonstrated by this middle photo. While there was no statistical significance in the differences between their answers, we see here that study homeowners are more likely to prefer properties that are as landscaped as possible, whereas comparison homeowners are more likely to prefer partially natural properties. When asked about their thoughts regarding the number and variety of trees, shrubs, pollinators, and wildlife on their properties, both groups overwhelmingly reported that their properties were adequate regarding most of these categories, though both described wanting more pollinators, more variety of trees, and less wildlife. When probed a bit more into these preferences, we found that comparison homeowners in older homes were statistically more likely to report that they believe native species were important, as well as species that attract pollinators. And when asked about their attitudes toward the maintenance of their property, the majority of both study and comparison homeowners did not view the trees and shrubs on their property as a nuisance, with only 16% of homeowners reporting that they believe some of the trees and shrubs on their property were a nuisance. For both groups, the majority of respondents maintained their property by making decisions about landscaping. This was followed by the removal of invasive species, maintaining a vegetable garden, providing bird feeders or homes, and incorporating plants for pollinators. Regarding the maintenance of trees on their property, both groups were most likely to prune their trees. We also asked homeowners what activities they were most likely to participate in on their properties. For both groups, the majority listed grilling and outdoors as their most practiced activity, followed by gardening, though we found that the comparison homeowners were statistically more likely to list gardening as an important activity. Next, we asked homeowners about their relationships with professionals and experts involved in the maintenance of their properties. So while nearly all residents reported that they made landscaping decisions on their own, a majority of respondents from both groups reported hiring a landscape service, with about half hiring a tree care specialist to care for their trees. We did find that comparison homeowners were more likely to consult with a certified arborist, with nearly half having done so in the last year, being 2019. On the other hand, the study homeowners in the brand new homes were less likely, particularly in the previous year, to consult with a certified arborist. Both groups, however, were as likely to speak with the city's forestry section, with nearly half having done so. One of the last things we wanted to understand was the general knowledge that these homeowners have regarding the natural aspects of their properties. We found that the comparison group who owns older homes was statistically more likely to have correct knowledge about the soils on their properties, and were able to identify whether the vegetation on their properties was non-native or invasive. Comparison homeowners were also more likely to report observing tree-related pests and diseases on their properties, and were more likely to list seeing specific instances of emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, and oak wilt. The fact that comparison homeowners are more in tune with the natural aspects of their property also makes sense, because as you may recall, we did find that this group was statistically more likely to list gardening as an important hobby. And finally, to explore the attitudes surveyed homeowners had regarding the environment, we used the environmental attitudes inventory. This inventory was created based on a synthesis of existing literature and proposes a method of measuring environmental attitudes that is based on broad evaluations of perceptions or beliefs regarding the natural environment. So the two skills that we used in our survey were designed to measure survey respondents' perceptions and attitudes towards the natural areas on their properties. So the first refers to the enjoyment of nature and is defined as the belief that enjoying time in nature is pleasant and preferred to spending time in urban areas. We found that both groups believed enjoying time in nature is pleasant and preferred to spending time in urban areas, and there was no statistical difference in the means shown here. And the second scale refers to the altering of nature, or the belief that humans have the right to change or alter nature. So when we asked both groups questions regarding the altering of nature for human benefit, we found that the new homeowners were more likely to agree with this sentiment, while comparison homeowners were more likely to believe that nature should be preserved and not altered by human activity. These findings align with our previous results, where we found that both groups seem to appreciate and care for the trees and natural areas on their property. But because study homeowners are the owners of new homes that have more recently altered their property, it is unsurprising that they would lean towards the belief that altering nature and remaking the environment for human goals and objectives is justified. Okay, so let's go through a summary of the results by looking at what we found for study homeowners, comparison homeowners, and what was similar between both groups. So for the owners of new homes, our study group, we found that these residents are newer to the city, have higher property values, and higher household incomes. During the development process, they were a bit removed from the decision-making, allowing developers and other professionals to make major decisions regarding the trees on their properties. Many had little knowledge of whether trees lived or died after construction occurred, and lacked the knowledge on the natural aspects of their property. These homeowners were also more likely to believe that humans have the right to alter nature. On the other hand, we have our comparison group, the owners of older homes. These residents are older, have lived in the city longer, more likely to be retirees, and are very likely to be self-described gardeners. They're also more likely to find native species and pollinators important, have more knowledge on the natural aspects of their property, and are more likely to hire an arborist. So all of these are statistically significant differences that we have found between these groups. Now for both groups, this is where we found no statistical significance between groups, meaning that both groups were just as likely to list more practical reasons for purchasing their homes, such as resale value and location to schools, prefer partially landscaped lawns, plant trees and witness tree loss, make landscaping decisions, including pruning their trees, hire landscaping and tree care professionals to care for their properties, communicate with the city's forestry section, and express an appreciation of nature. Now let's compare what we found in our study with what existing literature has found. This is definitely not exhaustive yet, but just a start to the conversation. So first, we find that the location to quality public schools is one of the most influential factors for home buyers. In a study that analyzed the moves of 4,000 home buyers across metro regions, school quality was linked to an increase in home prices within the school's zip code. For the most part, it is understood that people prefer park-like landscapes with broad expanses of grass and trees, though this has also been found to depend on region and culture, such as Western and non-Western experiences. Homeowners tend to prefer tidy landscapes with manicured lawns, which is often seen as a community responsibility. However, this paradigm may be shifting due to an increased interest in understanding of native and pollinator species, as well as water conservation. An online survey by the National Association of Landscape Professionals found that 40% of Americans with lawns hire a lawn care professional, and 51% of those individuals hire tree care professionals. Studies have found that people like trees and tend to have favorable attitudes towards tree ordinances. However, in some states, such as Florida and the United States, for example, private tree ordinances are vulnerable to regulation that limits the oversight and power of local government to protect trees during development. So this provides yet another example of why it is important to work with and include community stakeholders in the decision-making process surrounding trees, because ordinances definitely aren't the only solution, particularly if there's state regulation that looks to remove them and limit their effectiveness. And then critically, studies continue to find that homeowners lack the nuanced knowledge regarding the natural areas of their properties. So with private residential land representing a significant portion of total land use, homeowner engagement and education remains an important component of resilient communities for both trees and people. So what do the results tell us about the role of tree preservation and resiliency in our communities and urban forests? So we found that homeowners in our study appreciate nature and the natural areas on their properties, but similar to other studies, they lean towards valuing aesthetic benefits and may be swayed by cultural norms, such as the pressure to have manicured lawns and turf grass over more natural landscapes. Furthermore, the stated preferences that homeowners report may conflict with what they practice. For example, while both sets of homeowners desired more pollinators on their properties, only a few reported that they intentionally planted species that attracted pollinators. And according to the residents of recently developed homes, many were removed from the decision-making process, and many rely on professionals and experts when making landscape decisions. For this reason, it is important to establish ordinances that follow best management practices and science to guide communities and how to better protect and grow the urban forest. The fact that the majority of homeowners in this study for both groups rely on experts and has some sort of relationship with the city's forestry section speaks volumes and provides incredible opportunities for engagement. And furthermore, this provides opportunities for all parties to be involved in the decision-making process regarding the trees in their neighborhood, which leads to more engaged and resilient communities. So that being said, and as a result of this research, we recommend that cities continue introducing and updating their urban forestry management plans. For cities that have yet to do so, there is a plethora of resources to be found online or through your local chapters. It is also important to introduce ordinances that protect both public and private trees. As we learned here, ordinances are critical because they uphold science and practitioner-based best management practices, regardless of the knowledge or attitudes of homeowners or developers. Once these types of things are established, assessing the effectiveness of these types of policies and programs can be a great way to explore what is working and what isn't. Furthermore, these types of projects are great ways to collaborate with universities, nonprofits, and homeowners, as was done in these two studies I described today. And finally, let's continue engaging with communities. Every one of us have unique perspectives and qualities that add value to the decision-making process surrounding trees and green spaces in our communities. Whether formally or informally, trees have such an amazing power to bring people together and build communities. Let us continue to focus on what brings us all together, and in doing so, make our communities more green, more livable, and more resilient in the process. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Please feel free to ask me any questions you may have. This research is currently in preparation and will also be published alongside another study where we surveyed the homeowners or the home developers regarding their knowledge and practices surrounding tree preservation during development. So thank you again so much.
Traditional skills and modern techniques. Whatever language you speak, you have a world to offer every day. Climb with the ISA.